Welcome to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Doctora Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape Servingness.
Saludos HSI familia and welcome to ¿Qué pasa HSIs? Today we are talking to Doctora Karla Silva, who is a first-generation college graduate, Chicana, daughter and wife to immigrants, mama, and scholar-practitioner. She serves as the Director of Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives at the University of Arizona. As a scholar-practitioner, she is committed to access, equity, and inclusion in higher education and works with students holistically using asset-based approaches such as community cultural wealth, funds of knowledge, and critical race theory. Karla graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology from Northern Arizona University, a master's degree in higher education from the University of Pennsylvania, and a doctoral degree in higher education from the University of Arizona. Today, we are going to learn about her research, which centers the experience of managerial professionals working at HSIs using testimonials as tools of resistance for educators. We will also learn about her work as Director of HSI Initiatives and as a leader in the AZ HSI Consortium. Let's go. Doctora, thank you for joining us on ¿Qué pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. Let's go ahead and start with, the question. Tell us about your Servingness journey.
Awesome. Thank you, Doctora. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so I currently work at the University of Arizona as the director for HSI Initiatives. But my journey to HSIs did not actually involve me attending any HSIs as an undergraduate student or as a master's student. I started at a predominantly white institution, Northern Arizona University, which is now an HSI as of recently, but they were not when I was there. And so really, started going to school there. And that's how I decided I wanted to go into higher education, by being involved with the TRIO Student Support Services program. So hashtag TRIO works. I'm a big fan. And so that's how really I got into higher education, and knowing that I wanted to go, work with other students like me who are first gen, who are low income, who come from immigrant backgrounds, and those kinds of populations. Really, the first time I heard about what a Hispanic serving institution was actually during my master's program. And so I attended the University of Pennsylvania. So also the first time I left Arizona, because I was born and raised here in Arizona. And so moving to Philadelphia, and while there was a Latina population, I grew up mostly around folks who had came from a Mexican background, or whose families came from Mexico. And so going and moving was very eye-opening. But really, when I was there, Dr. Mary Beth Gassman had opened the MSI, so Minority Serving Institution Center. And so doing my program there, having her as a professor, and then being like, whoa, like I had heard about HBCUs, but I didn't know about HSIs until that moment. And so she, I was really interested, and just went up to her and I said, hey, I'm really interested in learning more about HSIs. Do you all offer research assistantships or any kind of shadowing experiences? And so she was looking for 2 to 3 research assistants to help with some work around HSIs, particularly around like degree attainment percentages across the US. And so I was like, let's go, right? Because I'm Latina, my parents are from Mexico. And so that, just that kind of calling of saying like, well, like there are these institutions that want to specifically serve, Hispanic Latina students. And then a little bit of a rude awakening when I realized that just having this designation doesn't actually mean that these institutions are doing the work. And so I think that shook me a little bit, right? Where I was like, whoa, what do you mean someone has this designation, but they're just enrolling students? They're not providing services, resources. Maybe they're not really centering those voices. So I would say that's really where my kind of HSI consciousness came to life, was during my graduate program at Penn. And then from there, I came to the University of I went to Colorado State, but then I came to the University of Arizona. So kind of just fast forwarding it a little bit. And then again, kind of just working in areas serving first gen students, low income students, undocumented students, or students who had ever been in foster care. But I was still really interested in HSIs. And so I began a doctoral program at the U of A. We weren't an HSI when I first got here, and even when I first started my program, but there was work happening. And so I had gotten connected to Dr. Marla Franco, and knowing that she was really kind of pushing towards this designation and services and support. And so now that I've been here since 2015, the U of A did become an HSI in 2018. And then, more recently, having done my doctoral journey and really focusing on HSIs and managerial professionals, and then being able to move into my role within HSIs. I mean, now I do HSI things all day, every day. But it really was that from my time in Penn and really finding out about it, until now that I would say, right, like that's kind of where my consciousness has grown. And I'm really grateful to my professors and staff who I was able to kind of connect with and say, so what does this mean and what does this look like?
Awesome. I did not know that you had that connection to the Center for Minority Serving Institutions and Mary
Mhm.
Beth Gasman, who I know very well
Yeah.
as well. So, oh, thank you for sharing. I think it's also interesting that you said you went to NAU and that it wasn't it was a predominantly white institution, wasn't an
Mhm.
HSI, but it is now. And I think about when I say I'm a product of an HSI, my campus wasn't designated yet, but it was an emerging. I went
Mhm.
to Cal State University Northridge, but it felt like one. Right? That's that whole like, did it feel like it? So I assume it felt like a predominantly white institution,
Yeah,
which says
so
a lot. Mhm.
NAU absolutely felt, I mean, I really, I've told folks this, like that first year that I was there was such a culture shock because, I
Mm,
chose NAU really just based off of they gave me the most amount of money where I didn't have to pay anything out of pocket. Right, like full Pell eligibility plus some
mhm,
extra scholarships based on my grades. And so being there that first year was really rough. I was ready to like pack it up and go home because I was
mm,
also struggling academically. And it wasn't until someone invited me and said, "Hey, like, have you been to the Multicultural Center?" And I was like, "No." And then they were like, "Have you heard of Trio?" And I was like, "No." Right. And so it wasn't until I was at the center with other folks who looked like me, right,
mhm,
that I was like, "Oh, I can like speak my Spanglish, or I can talk about needing to go home
mhm,
and people aren't like, that's weird. You're in college. Why would you go home?" Um,
mm,
so yeah, I definitely felt, predominantly why I didn't feel seen until I kind of found those, right, like counter spaces where it was folks that kind of had
mhm.
similar identities or backgrounds.
Yeah, no, thank you for expanding on that. Cause yeah, it hit me pretty hard. I was like, I always say I went to an HSI, but really technically it was an emerging
Mm,
HSI at the time, right? It's been an HSI for over 20 years now,
right.
but then that gets to my I always talk about the feeling, right? Well, what does it feel like? Right? And to your work, which we're gonna get into, right? Like, does the University of Arizona feel like an HSI? That's probably
Right.
the goal, right? That y'all are
Mm-hmm.
working towards. So yeah, just some food for thought. I always like to, yeah, when y'all say things, I'm like, "Ooh, that makes me think about a thing." Um, so let's talk about your dissertation. I'm really excited to talk about your dissertation. Been wanting to talk about it for a long time, and was excited to invite you to the pod to talk about it. So your dissertation titled "Hispanic Serving Institution: Counter Story, Critical Agency of Managerial Professionals and Support Staff." In your study, you focused on managerial professionals and support staff who work with students each and every day, yet they often are ignored in the HSI research. I agree. You interviewed 24 participants who you co-created knowledge with. And we want to learn about that. So before we dig deep into the findings, can you just start us by defining,
Mm.
like you said, something that's not always in the research, managerial professionals and support staff?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, a lot of this research was because I saw myself in it, right? And so I know folks say, me search, right? And so who are these managerial professionals? Who are these support staff? And so for my dissertation, the way that I was defining that really was those folks who were kind of those quote unquote first responders, right? When students are in crisis or even when they're not, when they just want to celebrate. And so I really looked at folks by titles. So, coordinator, senior coordinator, assistant or associate directors, again, kind of those folks who are really on the ground giving direct student services, and who are working with those students really on that day-to-day basis. So I didn't interview anyone who maybe had senior leadership or higher titles such as like an assistant vice provost, or deans. I was really wanting to hear from those who were working with students every day, because that's been my role for so many years. And I think that they're often, again, like you mentioned, but they're often forgotten or ignored within HSI research.
Yes. And my argument is that we as scholars often study faculty because
Mhm.
of the me search thing, right? People are like,
Yes.
well, I want to explore my own experience, right? And so faculty are often in the HSI research or
Yes.
those high level administrators, but not necessarily the people on the ground doing the work, which is what you found, right? That these are the folks that
Mhm.
are actually the ones that are implementing Servingness. So tell us a little bit about that, about some of those findings
Ooh.
and how you came to that.
Yeah. No, I'm so excited because this is like one of the first times outside my dissertation that I get to talk about this. So I'm really excited. I was like, oh, I can't wait. Yeah. So, I interviewed 24 participants. In my head, right? Like as I was talking to all these folks, I was like, you all are doing this, right? So these were folks who worked in a variety of student services. So anywhere from admissions to multicultural centers, to trio services, to kind of like tutoring services. And right, I really did get a good breadth of folks from across the institution. Um, what was so interesting, right? And it was so hard for me to not be like, stop saying that during their interviews was most of them actually didn't think that the work they were doing contributed to servingness. A lot of them were just like, I think what I do is really important and I can see the value. That's why I'm here, right? But a lot of them, when I was asking those specific questions about how do you see your role influence or give the servingness aspect to the designation, most of them were just like, I don't see that. And so a lot of that, as I kind of kept digging in with participants, I think it came from really like this lack of knowledge of what exactly this designation was, right? So I think most of the participants understood, that really basic 25% enrollment of Latina students from the Department of Ed. But other than that, they weren't being brought in to have conversations, right? I asked questions about for the folks who were here pre HSI designation, which actually was a good chunk of them. I asked them, did you see a shift in your work? Pre designation, post designation? They were like, no, we've never talked about it in any meeting. Right. And so it was kind of this want of like understanding more, but also not knowing how to engage or who to ask, right? Because if you're a director or if their kind of senior leadership wasn't trickling down some of that information, they were like, well, I just kept doing my work the way I needed to without having that connection to the designation. So I think that that was a really interesting finding to me. Along with that, I would also say, a lot of folks who I interviewed did identify as Latina or Latinx. That was about 79% of them. And so I think that also spoke, right? Like they had this identity that directly tied to the designation, but even as staff or managerial professionals, they didn't feel like their identity and their identity as, kind of this managerial professional was even being acknowledged, or they were like, does anybody care, right? That we're now 25% Hispanic Latina students, but what do we at when it comes to our staff? What are we at when it comes to faculty? Like those are the kind of questions people started asking me.
Wow, yes. I feel like your dissertation is something I say all the time, but I don't have any like, data besides the anecdotal, right? People say
Yeah.
these exact things that you're saying. I mean, I've had people tell me we're not invited to the HSI. Like when you came and you did a workshop, we weren't invited to that workshop. And I'm
Mhm.
like, oh, well, why? Right. Like, and then I start questioning, like, why, right? Why are we missing this whole body of staff who are
Yeah.
actually in contact with students?
Yes, directly every day, right? They're the people that
Mm-hmm.
students, when they're in crisis, that's who they go to. When they want
Mm-hmm.
to celebrate, that's who they go to. And so for them not to feel like they have any connection or that the work they're doing is servingness, I think was really, well, eye-opening to me. And I think, for me, I had to reflect a little on like, right, what were my experiences? And, I'm so connected to the work now, but was that always the case? And so I think it was really interesting to kind of hear from them and learn that they really didn't see a connection at all.
Mm-mm. Yeah, for sure. Ooh, that's important. I think anyone listening, think about that. How are you engaging, right? Your managerial staff, your support staff. The community colleges in California say the classified staff, right? I'm always like including
Mhm.
classified staff in that conversation. The folks who are like on the ground doing the work every day. Are they invited? Are they having these conversations? And we can't make an assumption that all of those folks know what servingness is
Right.
or
No.
HSI or
Yeah.
how to serve, Latinx minoritized students.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole part of it, because part of, what folks were saying, I asked them a question around how have you engaged, right, with the HSI Initiatives office on campus, or, any kind of how have you engaged even with other entities such as like ASI or Haku, or, some other larger entities that might be doing some of this work. And most of them were like, one, we either don't have professional development to attend any of these type of trainings that cost money,
Mhm.
or two, specifically with the institution, it was, well, I'm not really supported either. I got that quite a bit, right? I'm not supported when there are open programs, forums, anything like that. I'm not really supported in going, or I'm not the one chosen, right? Quote, like chosen to go. They send
Mhm.
this person instead of sending, the whole office. So I think there was also a few folks who had that, like, I don't even know if it's for me, because my direct supervisor or the people I work with aren't even engaging, or they're actually kind of actively telling us that's actually not really your job. Your job is this job description. I had a few folks tell me that they had that conversation where they were told that's not really your job, right? And when
Mm.
we talk about it, it's like, no, serving this is everybody's job.
Everybody's
And so to
job.
be told it's
Yeah.
not really your job, right? It's like, okay, so then what do you do? Because this is your livelihood, right? This is how you get your healthcare. And so you're not wanting to push back on your superiors, right? To say, well, I really want to go. It's like, I still need my salary, I need my healthcare. And so that was also a really interesting, but also really just sad, and angering kind of feeling that came out for a lot of folks.
Yes, absolutely. I know we're going to get into the AZHSI consortium, but
Mhm.
I have an idea. I don't know if y'all have already done webinars for this population, but hopefully, like thinking about what do we learn from your
Mhm.
research, right? As we get through this whole
Yes.
podcast, I'm like, that's that. Yeah, okay. We don't have the funding to do it. Okay, maybe how do we make it free, right? How do we make it accessible? How do we make training, right? Training and professional development should
Mhm.
be available to all the folks, right? How do we
Yes.
do that? And do organizations like, y'all's consortium do that
Yeah.
kind of stuff? Not always, right? We have to actively think about that. So we'll get into that.
Absolutely.
We'll get
Yes,
into
yes, we
that
will.
one. But the other question I wanted to ask you about is also this idea that your people of color, women, Black,
Mhm.
Indigenous people of color, Latina folks are often the ones that are doing this work, but that are often underpaid, right? At this
Mhm.
particular level, right? Within the institution, not as much institutional power. So talk about that.
Yeah, so kind of like I mentioned, right, when I was doing my research, and the folks who did, I mean, 79% of them identified as Latina, Latinx, right? About 83% of my participants did identify as like, folks who identify as women. And so even just the people, I talk about that in my dissertation, I'm like, even just the people who saw my flyer or got an email about it, like the majority of them fell under, right, this umbrella of BIPOC folks. A lot of them were first gen. And so I found that really kind of interesting that they were also willing to put really more labor, right, to help me and to tell their stories. So I thought that was a really interesting piece too. But yeah, I was really interested, right, and we know this from other research, and again, anecdotal of what people talk about. These folks are often underpaid and overworked. They're constantly being asked to like take more on, but not being given, more compensation, or if somebody leaves, right, that's not really happening. And so a lot of what the participants kind of talked about were that exactly. So I think for me, it really reconfirmed those experiences for people. I really feel like they also talked, so when not just talking about like that physical labor, that labor in terms of like job responsibility, there was a lot of conversation around emotional labor, right? So I'm the only, I'm the only Latina in my office, or I'm the only Native American person in my office, right? Kind of being the only sometimes in spaces. And then because of that, right, like students or even other staff coming and like flocking to them because they were like, well, I know you're going to get it. I know this is kind of that, safe space, or a space that I can authentically be myself. And so folks talked a lot about feeling kind of very like disinflated, right? Like very just not being able to like go home and disconnect from work, right? Because there was such an emotional piece. And part of it, right? So when I did my interviews, we were also, it was during COVID. So a lot of people were talking about the emotional labor of like having to work with students whose like family members were dying, right? Students who didn't have access to food or Wi-Fi, right? So they were like, I'm constantly talking to students and in this like place of just exhaustion, right? And so it was like this overburden of emotional labor that happens. And again, right, like there's a lot of folks like Aker and Crenshaw and all these other people who've talked about that, right? This like emotional labor, particularly for women of color. And so that was a lot of the experiences that people were currently going through because of the pandemic. But I would ask them, pre-pandemic, did you still feel some of that? I know I asked some folks that and they were like, absolutely. Like I am kind of the person who, if a student needs something, they know they can come to me, and for better or worse, right? Like I'm gonna be there. And so I think that that was also, I feel like I keep saying the word interesting, but it was just interesting because it's reaffirming, right, that these folks, again, while still underpaid and overworked, they're here, and some of them might end up leaving. Like there were some folks who even talked about, especially because of COVID and just having, layoffs that happened, so they were taking on more work with students in particular, that they were like, I don't know that this is sustainable long term. I'm really starting to get bogged down. And that, for me was like, oh, that's sad, because like you're someone who's amazing at your job that students and staff want to engage with. So if you leave, right, what does that do, versus trying to come up with like a retention package of like, okay, we're going to pay you more because you're supervising more students because we had to put some layoffs. Providing stipends, folks talked about that, like stipends for like their Wi-Fi because they were working from home at the time, and saying like, I've asked for a Wi-Fi stipend and I'm getting told no, right? So folks were kind of giving off like, these are some of the ways that I feel I would feel more valued. And then when I ask them, I'm told no. So now my value feels lower again. So again, I think it just reaffirmed a lot of the work we've seen in the past around emotional labor, as well as just like job responsibilities across the board for these folks.
Yes, and now you're making me think about the fact that HSI work is often on top of this, right? So people that tend to do HSI work besides y'all, which we'll get to, right? Like that whole office, it tends to be like just sort of anybody that's willing to jump in and do it for free.
Yes.
Right? Like if you're willing to spend the time being on an HSI task force, which I basically tell everyone, you should have a task force, right? If you're willing to write some HSI strategic plan or the plan for the next 5 years, if you're willing to, create a Spanish bilingual, family event, translate FAFSA, right? Like those sort of things that people are doing on top of what they already are being. It's not on their job description to do servingness necessarily, or in most cases not, right? But people do, right? Because they want to.
Yeah. And I love that you say that, because I think, folks were giving those examples, right? Of like, I translate the website, I translate the newsletter, and, me asking like, do you get paid extra for that? No. When you were hired, was that like a prerequisite or like, part of the job description or duties? No. Right. And so those things happen. And I think it's folks being able to, in all honesty, kind of like abuse that, right? Like say, well, if you can do this, let's just do it. I'm not going to pay you more. And I know even that's happened to me. And I'm like, but if I don't do it and nobody else does it, then how are we going to connect with these families and these students? So really it ends up being, right, a disservice to the students and their families who we're trying to service.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the language thing. I mean, I talk about it so much, right? It's like you're asking people to translate whole things, and many of us cannot. You mentioned Spanglish, right? Many of us are going to be like, I can't translate this. I don't have the vocabulary, extensive vocabulary to even translate this in a way that sounds like beyond what a fifth grader could do. And we're going to send this to parents, right? Like that's a skill, right? Like it's a skill set.
Yeah.
And we're asking people to do it on top of their already job, or they're just doing it because they want to serve students and their
And
family.
I think it's also just, you saying that, and I'm like reminding myself, like there were folks who even said, similar to what you said, right? Like I don't have a translation degree, but I grew up with the language. I maybe took some college courses, or even folks saying, so I'm able to do it, but sometimes like I have to call my mom to say like, what does this look like? And then I'm like, now we're like involving your family, like it's free labor for your mom to review, or to say like, I'm trying to say this sentence, how do I say it? And then mom's on the phone giving tips and tricks, and then I'm like, no, like your mom should, say, hey, like here's my invoice, I helped you right? But those are the things too. It's like they start to involve their family too, because they want to make sure that the work looks good before they send it out. And then that, to me, I'm like, that's like a whole nother ball game on that end.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, now we need a stipend for mom.
Right?
The Wi-Fi stipend and the translation
The
stipend.
translation.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, all of these things are things we have to grapple with, right? At HSI, there's no easy solutions, right?
No.
It is not going to be answered with one meeting or one policy even. We got long-term work to do.
Yes.
So I'm glad you're uncovering it, and I know you're working on some publications we're going to see out in the future.
Yes, hopefully. Yes.
Yes. We're putting it out there. We're manifesting.
Yes, we're just going to manifest it.
Manifest it,
Publications
yes.
coming soon.
Yes, publications coming soon. But for now, we're learning just this.
Yes.
This is knowledge. This is research, right? The podcast is designed in that way. So the other question I wanted to ask you about was this like idea of reimagining institutional mission statements. That's really cool. You ask people to reimagine. I love that. It's right in line with all the, me with the freedom dreaming, right? And dreaming about something different than what we do, right? That's what we kind of want people to do. So anything interesting that came out of that? And I agree, interest is a great word for scholarship.
It's a good word to use. Yeah, no, I
Yes.
was really excited. So, I did my interviews and then I asked folks to do 2 kind of activities. And so this was one of them. And so what I did was I put the institution's mission statement on a Word document. And then I just said, this is the mission statement that the institution currently has. They've been in HSI at that point about a year. They've been in HSI for about a year. Take some time to just reimagine what this mission statement would look like if we included our designation, or if we included servingness into it. And so it was really interesting. I will say, like, a lot of them had kind of a little bit of trouble, right? Where they were like, well, what do you mean? Like, if I reimagine, almost that, like, who am I, right? Like, people were like, well, who am I to do this? Or why should I do this? And so that was one area, right? Where again, as like managerial professionals and feeling often powerless, right? We kind of would drown that out, because I would ask them after they did it, the activity, I would ask them a few follow-up questions about how did it feel, right, to do this. And so some of them talked about that. A lot of them wanted it to be very clearly stated in the mission statement. Like, we are a Hispanic serving institution as of 2018, right? And so a lot of folks were like, that's really all I would add. I would add just a sentence on it so that it is there. And when I would ask the follow-up questions, a lot of them said, I just want it in there because now you have to live up to this designate, right? So it was like, if you're putting it out there and saying this is our mission, like, you have to now do it, right? People can ask you about it because you're putting a statement out there. I didn't give parameters. So I will say some mission statements were a lot lengthier, right? So most mission statements I feel are fairly short, right? Not very long. But some folks were writing, quite a bit around just like, as a institution, we will serve, our Latinx population by providing services and resources, particularly around, I saw financial aid come up a lot in this, as well as like academic resources. So it's kind of a mix of what people wrote. I didn't end up putting it in my dissertation, but I'm hoping to, that's part of kind of the pieces I hope to put out in publication, to analyze that and to write some pieces around them and to share what some of those mission statements were. So kind of to share them out. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of institutions who have specifically made mission statements with the designation like in it, right? So very blanket, we are an HSI, and as an HSI, here's our mission, right? And so I think it would be a really cool tool to possibly be able to, like, how do we push institutions to maybe think a little bit more about, okay, so does your mission statement now, right, align with this designation as we see each year more and more institutions become HSIs?
Absolutely. Until it's required somewhere, it's probably not going to happen.
Mm.
Because I wrote a blog piece with my doc student, Maria Alexia, and we looked at campuses that have the seal. The seal is such a, seal of excellencia, which y'all have.
Yes.
It's such a great metric for people, right? It gets them like like working towards servingness, but then there's pieces that aren't in there, like the mission, right? Like,
Yep.
does your mission have to say that you serve Latino, right? From an excelencia perspective, it would probably be something like you serve Latino students, not that you're an HSI, right? Because that is really the focus of Latino-centered servingness, right? And yeah, until it's somewhere like that, it's not necessarily gonna be there. But you also bring up something important that some people are like, maybe, that I hear that a lot too, is like, maybe it doesn't have to say it, right? Like
Mhm.
HSI specifically, but like defining what HSI means, I think it's important, right? Like what,
Yes.
because we don't know what HSI means until we spend time thinking about what HSI means.
Yeah, and especially, right, because each HSI is so unique and dependent,
Hmm.
right? So it's like it shouldn't be a blanket statement and it shouldn't be a one size fits all. Every institution, right, depending on their demographics, depending on size, depending on location, allocation, right? Like everybody's going to do it a little bit different, which we should, right? What we do in
Hmm.
Arizona should not be the same that we're doing in Ohio, Virginia, Florida, right? And so I think that for the folks who were in and participated in my dissertation, right, they all kind of had this lens, but it would be really interesting, right, to do a similar activity across the US to kind of see like, well, what are other people
Hmm.
thinking? Like, how do they envision their own mission statements?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a fun conversation. I mean, I get to have that conversation with people all the time, and it's a really interesting, like just sort of goes all directions, right? Of what people believe. So good. I look forward to that one coming out soon. We're manifesting.
Yes.
Yes. So we've mentioned University of Arizona a couple times, and since that's your daily work, I mean, we have to talk about it.
Yes.
So the University of Arizona HSI website states that U of A received the HSI designation in 2018, making y'all a very young HSI. That's my
Mhm.
analysis. When I read that, I was like, oh, they're a young HSI. You feel light speeds ahead of most people in the work y'all are doing, right? But
Mm,
technically, right?
yeah.
Very, very young HSI, and have done some substantial work. So I think one question I had with that is, as I reviewed your website, there was no sort of processes of getting to the 2018. It was
Mm.
like 2018, boom, we're an HSI. And now we have all these resources, right? We have an office, vice provost, those sort of things. So anything about that, like what do you know about, I'm not sure if you were even involved in that, right? But the history of even what kind of efforts were made to become before you got that designation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I wasn't a part of it, but I feel really fortunate to know a little bit about the story of our designation and how we kind of came to be. So I know that the journey started, I won't be able to give you specifics, but I know it started quite a bit ago. And so in my role, I've been lucky enough to engage with kind of some of the elders. So folks who, either graduated from the U of A quite a few years ago, worked at the U of A in some capacity, community work. And so folks have shared stories about, right, when the designation Department of Ed created the designation and wanting to move towards it. And so folks talked a lot about, right, like engaging with like senior leadership, particularly some of our groups, like one of the groups that I work pretty closely with, they're called the Los Universitarios. And so they're a group of folks who graduated like between like 70s and 80s. And so they've been huge. They're all folks who identify as Latinx. They've been folks who have been huge in establishing scholarships for Latinx students and establishing the University of Arizona Hispanic Alumni Club, or WAHA as it's named. And then they were also instrumental in working with folks like Marla Franco and some other folks to really push that designation. And so a lot of folks, when I talk to them, right, for them, it's like, when you come to Tucson and you walk around, like it is a very, like our population of Latina folks is really large, but then you would walk onto campus at the U of A and a lot of them would talk about being like, I'm like the only one in my department, or the only time I feel that I see other brown folks is when I go to like the Guerrero Student Center, right, which is our Latinx cultural center. And so a lot of them kind of had pushed for that designation for years. And then having really a president at the time, as well as Dr. Franco, who really then started to do the work around like, okay, so what does an application look like as they inched closer, right? Like as we inched closer to meeting the 25%, it also became about like, okay, well, what services do we already have in place? Looking at gaps, looking and working with some of the cultural centers on campus around maybe filling those gaps or asking for more funding to kind of bring up the number of professional staff in those spaces as we started to inch towards that 25%. And again, we're just a little bit over the 25%. And so that's also right when you think about like our location, our large Latinx population, our proximity, right? We're less than an hour away from the Mexico USA border. So we are really young, and I still think there's a lot of work to be done. But as far as I know, it was about like a 20 years in the making process to get us to receive the designation, and the work started way back then.
Thank you for engaging in that. Yeah, I think we need to start thinking about how we document that. Season 3, episode 3 with UC Riverside, that's what that team,
Mhm.
they really dug into history, right, of UC Riverside, and how long Servingness had been going on. This season, we're talking to the Wisconsin network, HSI network, and most of them started this work before they were even emerging HSIs. They're like striving.
Yes.
So that's episodes will come out this season, really interesting. And they're writing that history now, right? But like that hadn't always happened, right? We just got the 25 and it's just there without thinking.
Mhm.
There's processes, things happen, policies change. Alumni got involved, university outreach was very involved, right? Like these different things. A president said we're gonna do this, right? Like those
Mhm.
things absolutely matter.
Yes.
It's not just haphazardly that we become HSI. So
Yeah.
so thank you for giving me some of that. So let's talk about your role as Director of
Mhm.
HSI Initiatives. How did this come about and what do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question because I do a little bit of everything. So when our office was created, or when we got the designation in 2018, right away, and the HSI Initiatives office was created. There was an AVP role that was created, and then the director role actually for me just became a director role. So I was hired on as an associate director, and then this last November, just due to like continued increased responsibilities and wanting to be able to do more work across the institution, I was promoted to director role. So that's been fairly new. But before me, there was one associate director before me, and I actually feel really great because I was able to be on that search committee. So at the time, I had been asked to help recruit and hire on their first associate director in this office. So again, it's all really new. Most of the roles we have in our office are like one person has always held it or one or two, right? So everything's still new because 2018 was not that long ago. My role is really about capacity building across the institution. So again, I mentioned this earlier, right? Like no one person, and not even our office, should only be doing the Servingness work. I think it's really important, and it shows a lot of commitment by our institution to want to fund this position and this office. But it's also up to everybody else, staff, faculty, everyone, right, to do the Servingness work. And so my role really kind of runs the gamut of a lot of things, right? So I run a few programs where we're engaging staff, faculty, and graduate students. I'm constantly kind of connecting and talking with our external partners. So that might be anyone from, the U.S. Department of Agriculture to Amazon, to our alumni work, right? So just trying to see like what are the different ways that we can bring different services, resources, assistantships, fellowships, right? How do we make sure that everyone our institution knows these are opportunities for you, these are for you, you are worthy of them. So a lot of my work is also working pretty closely with the staff across the institution, particularly, again, it's like I'm like, oh, my dissertation and my work always combine. But a lot of my work is working directly with the folks kind of on the ground, working directly with students, because it's one thing if I send out a newsletter or put it on social media that there's a paid research assistantship, right? A student might see that and be like, like, I don't know if I qualify or if I'm good for that. So a lot of my work is then saying like, okay, y'all, like, I need you all to like, here's an opportunity. It's due in a month. I need you to start shoulder tapping students. I need you to talk about this with the students you supervise, with the students you're meeting with on the daily. So a lot of my work, I would say, is that like networking networking piece and kind of shoulder tapping piece of opportunities. I also do all of our kind of communication. So our website's actually getting revamped right now. I'm working on that, but right, like website, social media, newsletter. So I really do a little bit of everything. But really my role is about building capacity, and a lot of my role is about just informing folks. And so something we've been kind of doing the last year is what I'm calling my head like these like little mini road trips, right? And so going into different departments and offices and places on campus to give anywhere from like 10 to 20-minute presentations where I'm really breaking it down for folks about like what are the basics, right? So I want you to understand that 25% from the Department of Ed. I think that that's cool that you know that. Okay, but for the U of A, what does it mean for our institution to do the work of servingness? And then how can you as faculty or staff learn more, engage more? So, that's a lot of what I've been doing is like just informing folks of what we're doing. So it's a lot of collaboration. So again, I've been thinking a lot about like what is my role, because I'm like, oh, I do a little bit of everything, but really I would say if I had to use kind of those two words, it really is about capacity building across our institution.
Yeah, I like that word, helping the whole institution figure out how they're going to do servingness.
Yeah.
And I think something that, as you know, Dr. Franco was on the podcast in
Mm-hmm.
season 1. Like I would say, a theme from her episode was like relationships, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's like you everything you're talking about. That's the same thing, right? Like y'all are constantly building relationships across campus to build the capacity, right, of the campus. And so y'all got to be friendly, relational kind of people in your roles.
Yeah. And for me, that's always been a strength for me. Like I love people, right? Like I was like, I love learning. I love being able to engage with people. And it has been really neat. Particularly around some of the programs that we have, like the HSI fellows, or we launched a new program of HSI ambassadors this year. And so it's been neat to work with some of those folks who are like, oh, like this is a great opportunity for me to learn. And like, we offer stipends. That's really important to our office is if you're going to come in and learn and then take back, like we want to pay you for your time that you're with us. And so I think those are the things that I get to do that are really exciting, where I'm engaging with folks. Like our ambassadors, we have folks from main campus, but we've got folks who are at our Yuma campus who are zooming in, and Douglas who are zooming in. So it's started now, right? I think that's something I really want to work on in my role is like, okay, how do we start really like our main campus? There's still work to do, but I feel like we've got a good grasp. It's like, okay, how do we start like our online community? So what does serving
Mm,
this look like for the Arizona online? What does
mm.
servingness look like for our campus in Yuma? What does servingness look like for our campus in Phoenix, right? So now I really want to start digging into like, how do we make sure that those folks, those students, staff, faculty also feel, right, like servingness integrated into their U of A bubble.
Yeah, for sure. Ooh, yeah, online servingness. That's a whole nother
Yeah.
conversation.
Yes, it sure is.
That's a hard one. I think we all figured that was hard during COVID times. Like, how the heck do you engage people, serve people in
Mhm.
this space?
Absolutely.
So one thing I would like to kind of work through with you as you're talking about your role is, a lot of campuses have directors of the grants, right?
Yes.
Like the Title V director, or even let's say an NSF, right? Type HSI grant,
Mhm.
which isn't what your role is, right? So talk to us about that, those distinct, ways that you're, because I think that's still not fully,
Mm.
understood by folks, right? That it's not the actual Title V director. And then how do you work with those people that get those grants? Because y'all have multiple grants. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, so our roles are fully funded by our institution. So, the HSI Initiatives office, which is, myself, another director who just does grants development, Riley, and then Dr. Franco, who's our vice president now. We are all fully funded through the institution. We're not tied to any grant in any way. So that's, kind of one major distinction I would say about our role and folks who have kind of that director Title V grant, which I think is really common, right? Like as I started to be more involved in the HSI world, especially professionally, I would meet a lot of people and right, they're directors of HSIs, but it's directly tied to a grant. And right, like grants are great. I talked about being, trio, and like they are really impactful, but they really are sort of this band-aid for the work, right? Because the money runs out. Hopefully, right? Most folks are wanting to commit to the work, and so they're going to resubmit, but that is not any guarantee. And so I think for us having our institution, right, our president, our finance officers really say like, no, this is important. We're going to institutionally fund it. I think that's huge. It also gives us a little bit more flexibility when it comes to our spending, right? Like if you ever worked for a grant, it is very like, here are the ways you can spend your money, and like, here are 20 more ways you can't. And so we have more flexibility to be able to kind of run some of the programs in a way that makes sense for us. So I think that it's really been interesting too this last year and a half, because I've started to connect with folks who are in similar positions as mine where they're not tied to grant funding. And there's really not that many. Like as I'm like meeting some people, they were like, oh, do you want to like, join this chat on WhatsApp? And I'm like, sure. And I'm like, there's like 8 of us, right? And then you think about like how many HSIs there are in the US, right? Over 500. And you think about all of that. And I'm like, wow, the majority of people with a similar title to mine are attached to grants. And so I would say, right, like this is kind of the model I would recommend in many ways for folks if they're able and their institution really wants to show commitment. Yes, keep getting the grants, but also institutionally, like you need to fund these positions so that they're maybe have more longevity and there's more sustainability. And yes, we have, to the other part of your question, we have quite a few different grants that are tied to HSIs. And so my role really with them, I mean, again, my whole role really is around that relationship and capacity building. So I usually, if it's a new grant that comes up, I often may sit on the search committee for those positions, right? As a search committee member or even a chair. So that's one way that I start to get to know them. Once someone is hired on and brought on, then I usually do meet with them, right? So we get to know each other. We might have a few meetings. But really a lot of my role with a lot of these are creating the relationship, and then how can I best support you? So sometimes that means not a whole lot. That might just mean I'm going to send you a flyer. I'm going to keep you updated, right? Like as we keep going. Sometimes that does mean I might get pulled in to help them with, setting up their social media, setting up maybe some web pages, things like that. But we do work pretty closely with most of the folks who have those positions because we also, right, like when it comes time to submit or resubmit something, they're often working with my office to get some of the narratives, or if they need kind of that letter of recommendation from someone in our office. So they might be working with Riley, who oversees all of the grants development stuff. And she's such an expert on all of that. They might be working with me where I might write some narrative around like how they work with the HSI Initiatives office, or kind of the larger, what does the U of A look like as an HSI? So it really kind of depends, but I definitely am connected to all of them. And then really my role is like, right? Like, what can I do for you? What helps the most? And often that is really just like, we need you to get the word out, right? Like we're recruiting students, we're hiring graduate assistants, we're looking for family, whatever it is that they need. We have like a pretty large following on our social medias as UA HSI. So a lot of times it's me just doing a lot of blast outs so that folks know that that's a resource for them.
Thank you for that distinguishing factor. I mean, I'm a big fan of like having an HSI director that's not the grant, that's funded by the institutions, say it louder for the people in the back, right? It's funded by the institution, right? It's a line item, it's not going away. But you're right. I agree. I think it's very few when I meet them. And ironically, it's often at the emerging HSIs. I don't know if your group, your group chat.
Yes, it's a lot of emerging HSIs, which I think is amazing. And then I'm like, everyone who's already an HSI like needs to get on this.
Yes, I've met multiple HSI directors, and they're at emerging HSIs. And so, that's great. Yeah, they're already on it even before getting there. And obviously you wouldn't have a Title V grant, right, if you're not already there. So thank you for distinguishing that. And as you're talking, I'm like, oh, I need to sign up for your newsletter. So anybody listening, there is a newsletter. I love y'all's newsletter, but when I changed institutions, I stopped getting it. So I'm gonna put that on my list. So anybody else listening, it's a great newsletter centered on Servingness. Follow it for sure. So I wanted to ask you about, so I mean, I follow y'all work. I read the
Yeah.
newsletter. I follow y'all on social media. I know y'all personally. And I see a lot of the structural moves y'all are making,
Mhm.
structural changes, which is absolutely 100% what we have to do in HSIs. But then the measurement, how are y'all, like what indicators, right, from the Servingness framework are y'all, would you say you're most focused on? And how do you measure them, particularly, those liberatory outcomes? Like,
Yeah.
are y'all thinking about those beyond, beyond graduation rates? So what would you say are your indicators?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, right, we are looking at graduation, we're looking at all of that, which I think most institutions are. Part of what the institution as a whole has been doing for some of the like around like sense of belongingness, and pieces of just like, do you feel like you belong on campus? Do you feel seen? So one thing that they've been doing, I'm trying to think how long fairly recently, maybe within the last few years. But there is a survey that goes out to all students, right? And then we do break it down by different kind of either ethnicities, gender, pieces to really pull out and see like where is everyone kind of falling on. And what has actually pulled out from this, and working with our assessment and research team, is we're looking and we're currently building a kind of like a sense of belongingness survey that would be very specific to our Latina population. And part of that is also kind of wanting to, so we're part of it is also kind of wanting to go through like the IRB process to be able to like talk about what we're doing, how we build out. And so we're working right now to kind of build what that looks like. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that I think that there are ways where we're getting anecdotes from folks. I think that the Seal of Excellencia keeps us very accountable, right? Like we've been awarded it and we were recertified with it in 2022. And so they asked some questions, but there's not a whole lot around the liberatory practices piece. So that is definitely, I think, an area of growth for us that we're trying to, right? Like one way is like the survey that we're wanting to do. We're wanting to do some focus groups. So not just the general survey, but we're also wanting to pull some focus groups in with our Latina student population, to really kind of gauge more how they're doing. We do also, right, with our Guerrero Student Center, which is our Latina cultural center, we've been working really closely with them as well to just kind of what does it look like for them, right, to kind of serve students in different capacities, working with them to try to apply for maybe different grants or things like that to get more funding to serve students as we see like the increase of our Latina population go up. And so I think that there are ways we could definitely do this better. And I feel like that is definitely for the University of Arizona is a growth area that we haven't been able to fully tap into yet.
Thank you for saying that, because from the outside looking in, it's like, oh, look at the University of Arizona. They're doing so many amazing things, which y'all are. Yet there's still more things to do, right? Like
Yeah.
how do we do all of these things?
Yeah. And I think, that's where this like capacity building has been so
Mhm.
important to us because our office, again, we're 3, 4 professional staff, graduate assistant, maybe 1 or 2 student assistants. And that's where it's like, this is so great, right? That we have this dedicated staff, but right, like this is everyone's work. And so that's why the capacity building, I
Mhm.
think, is so important because and again, like we're such a large institution, right? Like on any given day, there's like 30 to 40,000 students or people on campus. And so then you
Mm.
think about like there are sometimes like in parts of the campus are doing Servingness and like we don't even know, which is really great. But then I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
like what are you doing and how are you doing that? And like let's connect, right? But it's such a large space that sometimes people are doing some of that work and we just don't know because people are taking it upon themselves saying this work is important. I'm just gonna do it. And I'm like, great, I want you to do it. I'm just like very now curious, like what are you doing? And can like other departments or colleges replicate some of that work or take what you're doing and shift it so that it works for their students?
Yeah, absolutely. Whew. So I wanted to also ask you about some of your external work, right? Like y'all are really good, I think, about working like with the external environment. One area that is like almost not talked about ever, but that I've seen y'all doing some work with is around alumni, right? Alumni
Hmm.
engagement. I talk about it in the book, but the book is a freedom dream. I'm like, here, do this. But a lot of we haven't even tapped into alumni, right? A
Mm-mm.
lot of campuses. So how are y'all doing that?
Yeah, so I think for us, we have really strong connections to both the groups I mentioned earlier. So WAHA, the University of Arizona's Hispanic Alumni Club, as well as the group Los Universitarios, right? And so I think we've been really intentional about like cultivating that relationship and then maintaining it. So we meet pretty, like with Los Universitarios, we meet with them about monthly. We get lunch with them just to check in what's going on, what are their needs as past alumni, what is coming maybe down the pipeline on our end. With WAHA, it's the same thing. We meet pretty regularly with their president and with their scholarship, because they have a full scholarship chair who they give out lots of scholarships, which is amazing. But that's really our way to tap in with them, is just meeting regularly and then letting them know, like, we're here to support you, right? And so some of the ways we've seen that is we've hosted some alumni webinars where we've invited alumni to come and talk about specifically servingness and as alumni. So, we've asked them questions. For those who graduated recently, we talk more about servingness and like, what was your experience like, right? With folks who graduated pre the designation, when we bring them on, we'll talk to them about like, so how do you think that might have been achieved, or how do you see that now as an alumni? Like, does that make you want to engage more, right? Like, what do you see, or how do you see that connection happening? And so that's really been our way to engage with them, is through those two clubs and staying connected. And then really just support, right? So WAHA had their like 40th anniversary last year. It was like this huge event, right? And so for us, it was like, okay, how do we advertise the event? How do we maybe buy a table at the event? How do we show up and connect, right, to all the different people, and just make sure that they know like we are here to support them? So I think a lot of times it sounds so simple, but it's like just show up, right? Like, if you show up to these meetings, if they invite you, like, show up. If they invite you to an event, show up, right? Like, sometimes that's almost like the first step, right? Is like, yeah, you can email, you can do these things, but if we're not showing up to some of their events or their meetings, then they might not really feel like we care or that we are listening to them. So that's really been our way to engage with our alumni.
Yes, exactly. And I like that you distinguish. I always talk about like your young alumni are probably pretty much reflective of
Oh yeah.
your population. Your young
Yeah.
alumni are HSI alumni.
Yes. Well, and that's, a lot of the folks who graduated pre 2018, like, they're just like, oh, yeah, like, I knew the U of A became an HSI. Similar to you, some people, if they were really engaged in certain organizations, they were like, I kind of felt like I was already at an HSI, right?
Mhm,
Like, I joined
mhm.
a Latino fraternity or something, right? Where they're like, I was engaged in this. And then other people are like, oh, that would have been great, right? Like, I didn't feel like I belonged. I really just like went to school, went home, and graduated, and now maybe I have some connection, but and so it's interesting to kind of see the differences between both of them.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, we definitely have some more work to do about alumni. So anyone
Yes.
listening that has a dissertation to write, alumni engagement at HSI, that's a good topic.
It's a very good topic.
And then send it to us.
Yes. And then
Me,
I could be on the
Karla.
podcast.
Yes, yeah, and be on the podcast. So many spaces to get the word out.
Mhm.
So the other area where I know external sort of influences that y'all are also tapping into is private foundations, donors. And that is an area I think a lot of HSIs don't do very well either, right? Like, we kind of Title $5 or nothing, right? And it's like there's so many
Mhm.
more dollars that we could be using for HSI work. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. This is like an area that I also like, run into this role and I was like, what? Right. So like I've had, and it's so funny because I'll tell my parents about this and they're like, why are you meeting with those people? Like, we've had meetings with Amazon, with Victoria's Secret, with like Northwestern Mutual, right? Like, it's just so folks are, it is what you said, like, folks, there's money everywhere and not just in grants. And so for us, right, it has been about tapping into that. So a lot of times those companies are looking to diversify their workforce. That is the line that I get told a lot, which is great. And then it's like a conversation then, right? So then what does that look like? Like, what are you trying to do? One thing that I've learned from Dr. Franco, which I really appreciate, right, is like, we are open to having these conversations, but like, we're also going to ask you all the hard questions, right? Like, okay, you want to diversify your workforce? That's awesome. How do you have affinity groups? Are you offering competitive pay? Are you offering stipends for moving, right? Like, those are the things we ask when we're working with these companies. And so one of the best companies, or one of the companies we've really gotten to work with that I think has given us a good model as we keep kind of working with more external folks, has been Amazon, right? And so we had, quite a few conversations about what they were looking for and what we were looking for. And they were able to fund us, like a student assistance before. They funded, they were willing to fund some of our like Hispanic tailgate, and really just getting, right? So like our student assistant with Amazon, their role was within HSI Initiatives. So not only were they doing like the Servingness work within our office, but a lot of their role was to make sure that students knew about opportunities to get like paid internships or to apply for jobs with Amazon. And so the student that we worked with actually had done an internship with Amazon before getting hired. And then when Amazon and us were talking and they were willing to kind of give us some money to pilot these programs, because it really was for them to lead to diversifying their workforce, they said, we're going to give you this money. This is what we're expecting, but like y'all can do it however you want, which again is so, so nice, because when you're working with grants, they're very specific on how you have to do everything. Where with some of these external companies or larger companies, we're going to have a conversation about what expectations are, but we really got to decide then like how we were going to hire someone and then how we were going to get the word out about these paid experiences for students. And so that's been really fun and exciting, because we also external partners in terms of like working with like the local community, or folks in Phoenix, right? Because we're only about 2 hours away. And so it's really been about, again, it's the relationships, right? It's like, how do you cultivate those? So yeah, I think that's kind of where I'll end it there.
Yes, for sure. Ooh, untapped partnership with Victoria's Secret.
And
Yeah.
and yeah, well, and then sorry, I'm just gonna add one more thing, because you just made me think of something with Victoria's Secret. Like these people come to like your recruitment fairs on your campus. So,
Mhm.
right, if your institution like ours has some kind of job fair where these companies are coming, right? Like, yes, they're for students and for folks looking for jobs, but right, like when Victoria's Secret came to that, we also were able to put a meeting in person where we got to sit down and talk about what the opportunity would look like for us to partner with them. And what I would say, like a tip for that too, is like kind of come up with your like a la carte menu, is what we call it in our office, where we say
Mm.
like, these are the different ways you can engage with us, right? And so like maybe smaller amounts of money where you can engage with us in our work, up to like larger amounts of money where we are able to maybe like hire students or put more larger events, right? And so I think that's kind of something to think about, like what are the things that your institution or office needs, and how do you come up with kind of this menu? And then really it can be, we've had a lot of folks connect to us directly, right? Because if they want to diversify their workforce, going to the HSI Initiatives office probably seems like a good
Mhm.
place to go, right? And
Yeah.
I'm sure they see that on the website and they're like, oh, we're going to connect them. But, we've also done some reaching out to some of these partners. And so I always say, like, it doesn't hurt to shoot that email and say like, hey, we're looking for some corporate partners or some external partners to whatever it is that you're looking to do. And then if you have that a la carte menu that you can show them or talk them through, where they can see the different ways that they can engage with you, and then you're kind of just prepared for your ask right off the bat.
Yeah. Ooh, a la carte asks. Okay, I'm gonna have that, create that my menu for my don't private foundations I'm trying to get funding for to do research. Like,
Yes.
here's the couple things I would like.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's really helpful. So thank you for digging into that. And since I already plugged the AZHSI consortium, let's talk about that. I think the question, I mean, we get to have a whole nother episode just on like the development of that. But like, what is the benefit of having something like that at the state level? Like, how does it benefit? Y'all are putting a lot of work into it, but how does it benefit
Mhm.
even, your campus? How's it
Yeah.
like, sort of reciprocal?
Yeah. So, I think for us, again, like a lot of the work is at the state level, right? So a lot of the reason that the consortium came to be was that folks are hungry and wanting to engage with other folks at HSIs. There just like was no channel to do it, right? Or to talk about like what works on your campus. Again, every campus is different, but we're all within the same state. A lot of at least, the three the 3 public schools, they report to Arizona Board of Regents. The community colleges have their own system, right? So it's kind of like this want to connect with people, but there was no channel. And so how do you create something where people are like pulled in and saying, right, like this is the space to come and talk about all things HSI, but with a lens of coming from Arizona, right? Or being within the state. And so I think for us, what it has really done is is connected us to folks across the state. So that's huge. I think it's also just really like, again, I think we're doing, sometimes I have to remind myself, like, we're doing a really good job, but we could be doing better. So how do we connect and do better? But also a lot of our students tend to transfer, right? So like if they start at the community college and then they come to us, or if they start at one of the other Arizona universities comes to us, or vice versa, right? Like someone might come to U of A and say that my sister is a perfect example. She came to the U of A. It wasn't the spot. She transferred to a different institution in the state, right? But it's like, how do we maybe, now that all 3 public institutions are HSI, all of the Maricopa County Community District community colleges are HSI, like all of these are HSI. So students could really be transferring from HSI to HSI. So again, while the services and resources don't have to be and shouldn't be replicated, but how can we maybe talk about what does that look like, and how do we ensure that students don't get lost in the mix, or that they don't go from one institution to another and then have like this 180 experience of maybe feeling seen one place but not in the other, or not felt like that their culture and their background isn't honored. So I think that that's been some of the conversations we've been having. The consortium is a baby. It was formed in 2021, right? And so it is still in its infancy, and so there's still more work to be done. But I think it's really allowed us to expand and to ask questions. And like ABOR, the Arizona Board of Regents, who the University of Arizona kind of calls up to, right? They're kind of our entity that oversee like our budget and all of those pieces. But they have even, right, like they've had more conversation around HSIs. They're looking at like the budget, right? And so I think like those are some of the good things that have come out of the consortium, not just for us, but for other institutions who report up to ABOR. But that's the way to let kind of those senior leaders know, like, hey, this is a need. And even, we've had representatives attend like our annual summit from ABOR, right? Like now they're coming because they want to see like, what are you all doing? Like, what are these workshops? What are the conversations, right? And so they're even more invested, I think, in the Servingness work. And again, us as U of A kind of reporting up to them, if they start seeing this, if they're coming in, I'm like, now there's more exposure and they can really see like why this matters and like why we're doing this work. And again, right, it's like having those allies, especially in senior leadership. I mean, it's really important, right, to have those advocate and allies who are there for you and who are willing to kind of back up the work that we're doing.
Love, love, love. Oh my gosh, so much good stuff to think about. The fact that like, what if it was a HSI, like a servingness state, right? Like that's what I got
Oh,
from that, right? Is like, yeah, you can go to any institution, you still feel that same sort of thread of what like servingness feels like. It's not just one.
yeah, and we're really excited. We got a grant, the Hub Listos grant, and so we'll be hiring some folks specifically to be doing that consortium work, and to very specifically, essentially, be putting together like a handbook manual for other states or even regions who are like maybe wanting to create. Like we're going to be creating a blueprint, and so we're really excited for, we're in the like hiring stages of that right now, but that's really exciting because then it's like, okay, we're going to have that historical piece plus the blueprint to continue doing the work. Because
Right.
right now it's all
Absolutely.
volunteer run. So every co-chair, every committee member, we are all, again, right, like doing it out of this is important and we want to do it. But now to have, paid dedicated staff to do this work, I think is just going to really be able, we're really going to be able to like move some initiatives forward.
Yes. Ooh. Can't wait to see that, to learn with y'all from y'all's blueprint. And I know there are other states that are already modeling themselves after what y'all are doing. So it's phenomenal. Awesome. Well, we're at our time. So many questions, so much good content, but the final question. How do you answer it? ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Ooh, ¿qué pasa, HSIs? pay attention to your managerial professionals and to your support staff, and make sure that you're engaging with them and finding ways to retain them, because they're grassroots, they're doing the work, and we need them to make sure that servingness is happening. So ask them what's up and find ways to engage them and pay them more and make sure that they are not feeling overworked.
Yes, way to
There
bring
we
back
go.
in the
Yeah,
dissertation.
I was like,
love it.
I was like, do I go U of A or dissertation? I'm gonna go dissertation.
Yes, I love it. It's a great response to the question, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Thank you
Perfect.
for being here with us
Yeah.
today. It was a beautiful conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Gina. I'm really excited.